Psalm 93 is a short psalm with just 5 verses, but it packs a powerful punch. Some have said that this psalm is actually a summary of the entire book of Psalms, that it contains the main theme, the central message of the book of Psalms. Like the other psalms in Book 4, Psalms 91 through 100, this psalm is untitled and was likely used in corporate worship. It is by genre classified as a hymn. One of the unique things about this psalm poetically is the number of verses that contain 3 lines. You'll see that 4 out of 5 verses contain 3 lines, and that's not typical in Hebrew poetry. Typically, most verses contain 2 lines, 2 parallel lines, but here we have 3 lines as the most common structure. This is similar to Psalm 29. It's not a bad idea to open up Psalm 29 and read it along with Psalm 93. There's a lot of similar imagery, and even this 3-line structure exists there as well. We note that in Hebrew poetry that the number 3 can mean completeness or fullness, and so perhaps that's what this threefold repetition is telling us in the structure of the psalm. Another thing we observe is that the psalm begins on earth, speaking of the world being established and God's throne on the earth established from of old. And then we move to the sea, the floods, the mighty waters, the ocean. So the sea has been placed in boundaries, cannot cross, coming upon the earth. So God is king over the chaos of the sea. And then the psalm ends in the temple. Now, this could be reference to God's temple in heaven or his temple on earth, which was a representation of his temple in heaven. Or it could be both. In fact, it probably is, because God's reign is everywhere. It's in heaven, it's on earth. And so we might even see here the water, earth, sky trilogy that we often see in the Psalms in these 3 elements. The first words of the psalm are, in fact, the theme of Book 4. The Lord reigns. Yahweh reigns. We'll see this in several of the Psalms of Book 4. It reminds us in the New Testament there is a similar confession. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. If you want to summarize the Christian statement of faith, it is this: Christ is Lord. Jesus is Lord. And by implication, he reigns. He is king. And so this is the good confession of the Old Testament, perhaps. The Lord reigns. Yahweh reigns. He's robed in majesty. He's robed. He's put on strength as his belt. Here's an example of that stair-step parallelism that we saw in Psalm 29 and other places as well. But this is showing that God puts on clothing. He's clothed in majesty, and his belt, it's all held together by his strength is his belt. World is established. It shall never be moved. His throne is established from of old. He is from everlasting. So echoes here of Psalm 90, which begins with God being our dwelling place through all generations, from everlasting to everlasting. He is God. So you're seeing a theme here with Psalms 90 now through 93 that all have something to say about age, about days, and God's everlasting nature. And that was important because Book 4 was likely compiled during the exile, when it seemed that God's temple in Jerusalem had been destroyed, God's king Zedekiah was imprisoned, and it felt like things were falling apart for the nation of Israel. And this psalm and others would have reminded them that, no, God is still on the throne. He always has been, always will be. In verses 3 and 4, we note again this use of the groups of 3. The floods have lifted up. The floods have lifted up their voice. The floods lift up their roaring. And then the word mighty occurring 3 times in verse 4 as well. Again, 3 suggesting completeness, fullness in its symbolic meaning. Read Psalm 29 and you'll see 7 times it will state the voice of the Lord is over the waters. Well, here we have the floods lifting up their voice. And so the floods are speaking, but God is mightier. God's voice is stronger, more powerful. And again, we even think of Jesus calming the storm on the Sea of Galilee, the voice of the Lord over the waters, calming the chaos. So God is king over the flood, Psalm 29 tells us, and that he has established a boundary that the waters of the sea cannot cross. So one day, if you're sitting on a beach and you want to read a psalm, this would be a pretty good one, because it reminds us of the great power of the sea, for chaos and death and destruction, and yet there you are on a beach. You are perfectly safe because God has set boundaries for the sea. He has controlled it. Verse 5 then concludes the psalm by taking us to heaven. And he says, "Your decrees are very trustworthy, and holiness befits your house, O Lord, forevermore." So there are two ways that God's power is manifest through humanity, two ways that we experience God's kingship. One is through his law, through his decrees, through the order, the way of life that he's prescribed for us. This is his good kingly authority over us, is to direct us and how we should live. And then there is his house. There is the place that we meet with him, to worship with him and relate with him, that he has come to us. He is a king who has given us good laws and who has made his home among us. Now that's some good news. Notice how the psalm, the two sections end with everlasting. Your throne is from everlasting, O Lord, you are forevermore. Again, accenting the timelessness of God, in contrast to the brevity of the life of man. Psalm 90, we're like dust. Psalm 92, the wicked are scattered. They're like grass. But God, in contrast, is forevermore and is fully trustworthy. Of course, this psalm reminds us of Jesus, not only his calming of the storm on the Sea of Galilee, but also the fact that Jesus is the fulfillment of the law in every sense of that. So, in a sense, we could say here that Jesus is trustworthy, and holiness befits your house, and Jesus is our house. Jesus is temple. We dwell in him. We meet God in Jesus Christ. So this great hymn that is, in fact, a summary of the entire book of Psalms points us to Jesus, who is the fulfillment of the Psalms.